Centre. It has a seniors section. They go for Shabbat dinners. There's a choir for them as well. 58 of them are Auschwitz survivors amongst a membership of about 1,500. And as Jonathan Ornstein said to me only yesterday, this was the deadliest place in the world to be 80 years ago. And here, the Jewish community can thrive once again. Well, let's bring in our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, who joins me now. And he takes this so seriously, doesn't he, Rhiannon? We know he's commissioned portraits, for example, of survivors, and he really wants their voices to be heard.
We have to remember that in terms of a pillar of his work, emphasising the importance of religious tolerance, of interfaith work, has been vital to him, both when he was Prince of Wales, but also now as monarch. And for him, it's been reinforced today just how poignant this visit to Auschwitz is going to be for him. We've got to stress that he will become the first British monarch to ever visit Auschwitz. And I think, of course, we saw today that very human connection that he has formed with that centre in Krakow. He was there speaking, gave a really poignant speech in which he talked about how the Holocaust had shown the depth to which humanity can sink when evil is allowed to flourish. But also for him, and I think it's really important to stress this point, of course, we're going to talk about the King's involvement there. He will be one of the most high-profile individuals at that event this afternoon at Auschwitz. But for him, this is not about him as an individual. This is about what he can do for those Holocaust survivors. Karen Pollock, who's the chief exec of the Holocaust Educational Trust, said about his presence that it would elevate the event on a global stage and be a really significant signal to the rest of the world. And so I think for him, giving that speech at the community centre where he was able to articulate that we now have a collective duty here in the world to make sure that while this remains a world, as he said, that is full of turmoil and strife, we make sure that we don't forget the important stories of those who were there 80 years ago, who underwent the most awful suffering at the hands of the Nazis. Also, it's important to point out that we've just had it confirmed this afternoon that as well as the Prince of Wales attending an event here in London, the Princess of Wales is also going to be alongside him. And both the Prince and Princess also, like his father, the King, over the recent years have done their bit to make sure that Holocaust survivors, their stories are elevated and remembered, especially on a day like today.
Yes, there was certainly a crowd outside the Jewish Community Centre yesterday when we were there. People thought he was arriving then. Of course, the visit was always supposed to be this morning. But as you said, he will be there amongst other nations who've sent dignitaries today. 53 nations, I think I counted, represented presidents, including the German president and the German chancellor as well, who are here. Such a difficult day for Germany to face. And certainly I was speaking to somebody earlier who suggested that Germany has a very clear education programme for its young people so that it confronts the errors of the past, its own history. And the King will be able to talk to those world leaders about the need, as you said, for religious tolerance. And as he put it, the responsibility of remembrance lies now in the living and those not yet born.
I think it's really important that we point out to what he says in that speech about how we still live in a world filled with turmoil and strife. He has quite a unique position, I think, amongst those high-profile individuals that you will see arriving at Auschwitz today as part of these commemorations. We talk a lot about the royal family and soft power. And whenever it comes to these big commemorative events, for them, they realise that they have a global profile well above, actually, many of the presidents, the prime ministers, the religious figures that you will see here today. But also, I think for him, he's not just going there as monarch. A source close to him said that he's going there as a man. And I think what we will see today is actually what we saw back at the D-Day commemorations as well. That real appreciation of the fact that we are sadly increasingly losing the lived experiences of those who were dehumanised in the most horrific manner. And therefore, the responsibility now lies with us to to continue that remembrance, not just of what they went through, but also the impact that it can have today if we turn our back on what religions are doing to each other, what individuals are doing to each other. And for him, that is going to be the key point of today as he, we're told, goes through what he sees as a very poignant journey for himself, that first journey to Auschwitz.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. So those dignitaries then arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the famous gate, the train tracks extended to expedite the arrival of Jews, many in the latter stages of the war from Hungary. The idea that the Soviet army was breathing down the neck of Hungary and it was thinking of switching sides, having been supportive of Germany. So German troops invaded and instantly started removing Jewish people from there. And on the day that the Soviet Red Army's 100th Infantry Division rolled in, they met little resistance. The SS guards had started walking with the survivors, some 60,000 of them, on death marches through Europe to other camps like Belsen-Bergen and others where they were found starved. And certainly we heard the story of one young man who started on the death march. It was -20. He couldn't continue and he collapsed. And yet he was picked up by 2 other prisoners and put on a pile of dead bodies so that the SS guards who were at the back didn't shoot him. He said he managed to crawl back into one of the camp huts here and waited. He weighed, he said, 23 kilograms when the Soviets finally arrived and found 7,000 emaciated people. They had had one final selection. If they were too lame to walk, they were left behind, much of the evidence destroyed. The stories of surviving so rare that every story was extraordinary. Well, let's hear one of those extraordinary stories of survival then of the Holocaust. Eva Clarke's mother was pregnant with her in Auschwitz at a time when being pregnant would have meant certain death. Eva and her mother were the only survivors from their family, 15 members of whom were killed in the Holocaust, including her father. Well, I met Eva and heard her story, a warning some of what she has to say is hard to hear. Eva Clarke, thank you so much for joining us. Yours is an extraordinary survival, really of the survival of your mother, is it not?
Absolutely.
How do you reflect through your life on what happened to her in that crucial period during the war and where you are now?
Well, my mother just said everything was down to luck. And she had a very positive attitude to life. She was a born optimist. Unfortunately, that never left her. And I just feel extremely fortunate, grateful for everything in my life, because I can't say anything else. I've been very, very lucky. And she always said that her whole survival depended on luck, nothing else.
Well, take us back to 1940 then. It's when your parents married. But what happened to them soon after?
They got married in May, on the 15th of May 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. And then they were amongst the first transports to be sent to this place called Theresienstadt or Terezin, which had been a former Czech garrison town, but you know, the Germans then turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And my parents were sent there amongst the first transports to help sort of set it up. I mean, they didn't have any option. And then they didn't know this, but they were to remain in Terezin for 3 years, which was a remarkably long, very unusually long period of time. And the main reason for that was that they were both young, strong, and well able to work.
Men and women were normally separated. Did that happen there? And if so, how did she become pregnant?
That's a very good question. My mother discovered that she was actually pregnant in 1943, and when I was a sort of curious teenager, I said to her, "How come?" And she replied in a very clever way. She said, "Well," she said, "it was very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story." But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences. because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death.
So your mother was moved, wasn't she, from this camp north of Prague to Auschwitz?
Yes.
Because your father was being sent and she chose to follow him. Now, why was that?
Yes, my mother volunteered to follow my father because she had no idea what Auschwitz was. They'd heard bizarre rumours, but they were just bizarre rumours. They didn't believe them. And she thought, you know, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know. But she thought nothing could get any worse. They would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw him again.
And your mother, when she arrived at Auschwitz, what were her first impressions of that moment? What were her senses telling her?
They arrive and they had to go through a selection straight away. And my mother was, and selection always meant life or death. And my mother got through a selection because she was still strong enough for work. They then had all their hair shaved. They then were given that sort of striped uniform and a pair of shoes, if they were lucky. And then they were tattooed with a number on their arms. And after that, they were sent into huts. And when my mother and her friends arrived in a hut like this, they were so frightened and so bewildered, they just couldn't work out what this place was. And they said to the women there, what goes on here? What happens here? When will we see our families again? And the women actually laughed at them because they couldn't understand that anybody arriving in Auschwitz would have no idea what went on there. And they said, well, we'll all go up in smoke and you never see your families again. And in that instant, they knew what went on there.
And the smoke and the chimneys, you know, that struck her too, didn't it?
The smoke, the chimneys, the smell.
What was the smell?
My mother said the smell was indescribable. She said it was a mixture of sweet and sour. And I know another survivor, and she arrived in Auschwitz with her own mother. And this lady said to her mother, it's an awful thing to say, why are they roasting meat here? But my mother said it was definitely sweet and sour. It was a stench, and it was something she would never forget, and thank goodness she never smelt again.
And she'd been questioned too by Joseph Mengele, hadn't she?
Yeah, she'd been at a selection, and where he was sort of presiding. Anyway, so she and these other women, they were sent out of Auschwitz. They were sent to a slave labour camp, to an armaments factory in a place called Freiburg in Saxony, near Dresden, where she was to remain for 6 months. And she was, during those 6 months, she was becoming progressively more and more starved and more obviously pregnant, which was very, very dangerous for her. But fortunately, none of the Germans realised she was pregnant until it was too late to send her back to Auschwitz to be killed, because Auschwitz had been liberated. We do know of cases of women who were pregnant and who were sent back before it was liberated, and Mengele took the most unspeakable revenge on them because he felt they'd got away with it.
What do you mean by that?
You really want me to tell you? Well, one of the things I know he did to a pregnant woman, when she came back and she gave birth to the baby, and he then bound her breast so she couldn't feed the baby, and she just had to watch the baby die.
So, again, your mother worked, heavily pregnant, yes, and ended up then moving again, 17 days on a coal wagon, no food, no water. How did she survive that long journey, 17 days, to move to another concentration camp?
You tell me. She doesn't know either. She did get one drink during the course of this 17-day nightmare of a journey. At one point, the train was stopped, the doors are opened, the dead bodies thrown out, and a farmer walked by, and he saw my mother. And he had such a shock. My mother described herself as looking like a scarcely living pregnant skeleton. She weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk, but there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised his whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm and he let her have the glass of milk. She maintained that saved her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. And the train went on. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon unaided. She thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience.
So your starved mother, 17 days of starving in a cold wagon, having been starved for 3.5 years now. How did she keep herself and you alive at this point?
There is no rational explanation. Gynecologists have wondered about it ever since. But she obviously was a very strong woman. On the 28th of April 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. Well, my birthday is the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again, I wouldn't be talking to you today. On the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckons she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays is put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators, but I always say perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time. And she was able to feed me, which is a miracle.
And when your mother was strong enough, what did she do then, and how did you end up in the UK?
We arrived back in Prague, and my mother said that was the worst moment of her 3.5 years incarceration in camps, because up to that moment she'd never allowed herself to think as to what had probably happened to all the rest of the family. She just never let herself think about it. But you know, arriving at your home station, you wonder if there might be anybody there to meet you, and of course there wasn't. But nevertheless, she still had a vestige of optimism at the back of her mind, and she thought that if any other member of the family had survived, there was a chance that it could be one of her cousins. And indeed, that lady had. And my mother just asked for some money to go on the tram. We arrived at my aunt's flat. She was there. I said to my mother a few years ago, you know, what would have happened if she hadn't been there? I didn't entertain that. We actually stayed for 3 years. Wow. And that was fantastic, because we had our own family support group. It was a tiny family, because we were almost the only survivors from what had been a very large, extended family.
So do you know how many were lost?
Of our closest family, 15. My 3 grandparents, my mother's 2 sisters, my mother's 8-year-old nephew, and various other members of the family. So 3 years later, she was able to consider a new life and a new marriage. And that's when she met and married my stepfather. My stepfather was also Czech and also Jewish, but he'd escaped to the UK in '39. He joined the RAF. He was too old to be trained as a pilot, but because he spoke languages, he was made an official interpreter. And after the war, he came back to Prague to pick up the pieces of his family, most of whom had also been killed in Auschwitz. And he met my mother, whom he had known as a family friend before the war. And they decided to get married, and they decided to leave, because this was 1948, and that is when the communists took over, and they did not want to live under a communist regime. And so we came to this country, and although we came legally, I like to stress, we might have come as refugees, we might have come as asylum seekers, we might have come as migrants. We arrived in this country, and my stepfather got a job quite quickly in South Wales. I think the uniform probably helped, and as a result, I grew up in Cardiff.
So what do you say now? I know you spent more than the last 20 years, you know, talking to people about this, spreading the message. What are the lessons that you want to be learnt from this story?
Nobody can identify with 6 million. Everybody can identify with one family. And so I tell my mother's story to try to make the history come alive. And because everybody likes a story, and everybody wants to know what happens next, you know, and you have to confess it's a good story. And the main message is to treat everybody with respect, to not be a bystander, to stand up for people's rights, and also I'd like to stress to try to think of people as individuals, not en masse, because there is such a thing as a mob mentality, and people do change and do act quite differently under those circumstances. So I know it sounds a bit sort of wishy-washy, I suppose. I can't be more specific, but you just want to try to make young people think and try to be critical of what is happening, what does happen, and try to stand up for people's rights.
And I know your mother died, as you said, at the age of 96. What would you like to say to her?
Oh, don't, I'll start crying. Don't.
Brave woman. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Eva Clarke paying tribute to her mother, Anke, who survived being held by the Nazis in various camps for 3.5 years, one of which, of course, was Auschwitz. Well, let's bring in our Europe correspondent now, Siobhan Robbins, who's also here at Auschwitz-Birkenau today. We're watching the cars of the dignitaries behind us here, Siobhan, but, you know, you're at the camp, you have been for a few days now. What are people telling you about how significant today is?
I think the main message that we're getting from particularly all of the survivors that we're speaking to is that this is so important to ensure that the memory of what happened to them isn't forgotten. The message of what happened to them isn't forgotten. I'm just going to move out of the way because I'm in a slightly different part of Birkenau to you. And I think from where I'm standing, you can see the scale of this camp, a camp which was designed for extermination, where the Nazis practiced precisely a method of killing at its most efficient. And you can see the remains of barracks, the guard towers there, which would have watched these terrified detainees as they were forced around to work, many of them starving, exhausted. In the distance, I can see the crumbled wreckage of one of the crematoriums where they sent people, sometimes on arrival. The majority of people who came here were actually sent to the gas chambers in those final years on arrival, particularly women, babies, the elderly, those who they couldn't get to work. And then others were forced to work, and when they looked too weak, then the guards would select them, they'd write down the numbers that we've seen on some of the survivors' arms, and the next day we're told they would be sent to the chimneys. And I think it's so hard to understand the level of horror that people who were here saw and survived. One of the survivors that I spoke to, Albrecht Weinberg, who's 99, and he survived Auschwitz, he survived a death march from here where the Nazis moved people before the Red Army came and liberated the camp. He then was sent to another camp, and he said that there was so much death, there was so much killing, that you couldn't think, that you were numb.
And today, then, this afternoon, we know more than 50 nations represented on what is also World Holocaust Day, of course, picked to be the liberation of Auschwitz. What can we expect later on?
Well, the tent has been set up near the gate of this camp, and that's where that train would have come through, bringing some directly to the gas chambers. And we have seen 50 survivors who've managed to return here already today, going to the other main camp and laying candles and flowers at the death wall where many people were shot. Now, they'll be there in the audience, but also the event is shaped around them. Some of those survivors will give speeches talking about what happened to them, but also looking forward, because as I said, this really for them, in some cases, they feel maybe their final opportunity to stand here and bear witness to one of the greatest crimes in history. And in the audience, there'll be dignitaries including Emmanuel Macron from France, Olaf Scholz from Germany, King Charles representing the UK. Now, he's already been speaking to Holocaust survivors, and at that point, he really underlined that message that the survivors here have been given, which is that it's now so important for the next generations that we carry that responsibility of memory on our shoulders and pass it on to the generations that come, so that the crimes that happened here can never be repeated.
Siobhan at Birkenau, where most people were killed. Thank you. Well, let's bring you the latest pictures then of King Charles. He's been about an hour away visiting a Jewish community centre in Krakow. He had opened it himself back in 2008, and as you can see, the crowds there to greet him. He really is, one of the people that the crowds want to see, really shining a spotlight on this day, the first time that he has been, or a sitting monarch has been, to Auschwitz. As we look at these pictures, let's bring in our events commentator, Alistair Bruce, who'll be commentating, I know, Alistair, on the commemorative event to take place in half an hour's time. But how important is it for King Charles to be here? He was born just after the war, wouldn't he? But he'd have heard the stories from his own mother and father and grandmother too about life in the Blitz in London.
Well, like so many people caught up in the story in their lifetime, even though it happened before they were born. For the king, he remembers his grandmother, Prince Philip's mother, who was known as Alice, but she was Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark. She lived in Athens during the war, and she hid away 3 Jews who were being searched for by the Nazis, who were then in occupation of Greece. And she looked after Mrs. Cohen and her 2 children throughout the war. And whenever anybody came to her door, she was, of course, related to the former kings of Greece. And she used to tell them to clear off and get their soldiers out of her country. And amazingly and proudly, she defended her side and made sure that Mrs. Cohen and her 2 children survived. She was given the privilege after death of being buried in Jerusalem. And the king has been to visit the scene of his grandmother's burial. And I think for him, as a child, hearing her stories, learning about the Second World War through his parents' generation, and recognizing that on this occasion he can, as head of state, bring the attention of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth to this event, which marks at Auschwitz the scene of the largest mass murder in history. And it is, I suppose, a reminder that although this is historic, there is nothing historic about intolerant ideology, hungry to blame and hate.
Alistair Bruce, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's bring in Dov Foreman now. He is the great-grandson of the Auschwitz survivor Lily Ebert, who wrote about her experiences at the camp, and together with Dov used to speak at schools and media events to ensure people never forget about what happened during the Holocaust. Lily died last October at the age of 100. A difficult day for you, the first Holocaust Memorial Day without your great-grandmother.
It's an incredibly difficult day, the first without my great-grandmother, but that pictures and is kind of a wider scale for Jewish people, which is that this is the first Holocaust Memorial Day for me and my family without my great-grandmother, but this is also a turning point where in the future, who knows how many survivors we're going to have with us every year on Holocaust Memorial Day. As you said previously in the reporting, there are only 50 Holocaust survivors there at Auschwitz today. And so as time moves on, as the number of survivors dwindles, as the level of knowledge about the Holocaust continues to go down, and as the anti-Semitism rises and Holocaust distortion and denial, especially online, rises too, we need to ensure that we keep these survivor testimonies alive and that we become their witnesses. And there was a poll which was released yesterday, which was incredibly frightening, which shows that 1 in 3 young adults, that's 18 to 29-year-olds in the United Kingdom, can't even name one concentration or death camp or ghetto from the Holocaust. That's incredibly worrying. And it shows that today, on the 80th anniversary, since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and since the end of the Holocaust, there's so much more work for us all to do.
Yes, and your great-grandmother spoke so beautifully about it. While you were speaking, actually, we've talked earlier about that King Charles, has been so committed to listening to survivors' stories. And I know he commissioned the portraits of a number of survivors to become part of the Royal Gallery, one of which was Lily. How important was it for her? Because it memorialises, her as a voice for the dehumanisation that happened here at Auschwitz.
Well, my great-grandmother met the King on a few occasions to share her testimony, and he was always someone who wanted to listen, who cared deeply and was moved deeply by her testimony. And we can't thank him enough for his support to the Jewish community, both today but also on previous years and throughout his life, kind of commemorating the Holocaust. And he wrote the foreword to our book, Lily's Promise, and as I say, he was always someone who deeply cared and was moved by her testimony. He, like other world leaders, wanted to ensure that when we say never again, it's not just an empty mantra and phrase, but it actually means something. Too often, on Holocaust Memorial Day, people sit together and they say on TV shows, in parliaments around the world, that never again should mean never again. But actually, we've seen hatred on the rise again. We've seen people allow it to go unchecked and unchallenged. And the lesson of the Holocaust mustn't just be to sit here and to commemorate 80 years on. It must also be where those hatred can lead to, because Auschwitz is not a place that fell from the sky. The gas chambers were not built overnight. That's always what my great-grandmother and the other survivors say. She used to say that this was built up over years through basic words, through hatred. And those survivors today are warning us that they see echoes of the past in society today. In my great-grandmother's final months, she was incredibly worried about those words that she was seeing on the streets. And so I think today we have to come together to commit to actually ensuring that when we say never again, we mean it. And that we're going to say that never again is not just never again will there be gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau built, purpose-built factories of death, but also never again will we stand idly by as this hatred is rearing its ugly head again in society.
Yes, as you're talking now, we're just seeing some of those who've gathered together to witness the commemorative event this afternoon. This big tent that's been put over those famous gates at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the rail track that runs straight through them, extended, in fact, to expedite the removal of Jews, when the Hungarians started arriving in great number, showing the horrendous efficiency, really, of the gas chambers under the commandant who returned for the process, Rudolf Hess, who wrote a book, in fact, between his trial and his execution, laying out plainly, what happened here at Auschwitz, part of the record, really. But tell us about Lily's story, Dov. What happened to her and her family?
My great-grandmother was born in 1923 in Bonyard, Hungary, in a small suburban town where her Orthodox established family had lived for over 200 years. And she lived a relatively peaceful childhood, one which mirrored the one that I live now as a young Jewish, that I lived and grew up in as a young Jewish person in the United Kingdom. She said she never experienced anti-Semitism, but that all changed in March 1944 when the Nazis invaded Hungary. And almost overnight, everything changed. They were forced to sew yellow stars onto their clothing. They were only allowed out at certain times. And then a few weeks later, they were pushed into the poorest part of the town, only allowed to take a few belongings with them into what we now know as a ghetto. A few weeks after that, in the grueling heat of the summer, in July 1944, on the 5th of July, my great-grandmother, together with her mother, 3 sisters and youngest brother, and over 100 members of her extended family and the rest of her Jewish community in Bonyard and the surrounding areas, were crammed onto a cattle truck, hundreds in one carriage, and taken to a place that they didn't know on a 4-day journey with only 2 buckets, one for water and one for human waste, to Auschwitz. When they arrived, my great-grandmother remembers looking through a little creak in the door and seeing skeletons moving around. She had no idea where she had arrived to. And a few hours after she had arrived, she asked someone who had been there a lot longer than she had, "What place is this? What's that terrible smell? What factory is here? What do they produce here?" The person turned to her and said, "This is not a factory. That's where they've just burned the family that you came with, who they sent left." My great-grandmother's mother, her youngest sister, and her youngest brother, along with over 100 members of her family and 14,000 other people that day, were sent to the gas chambers. They were murdered and cremated at Auschwitz within hours of arriving. And that's the same story of 80% of Hungarian Jews, over 400,000 people who were deported to Auschwitz between March and July 1944. And, my great-grandmother's story of survival is not the typical story of the Holocaust, because the typical story has no witness to tell it. The typical story involves the obliteration, the murder of entire families, towns, villages and communities, in forests, in rivers, by ravines, in their own homes, and in purpose-built factories of death like Auschwitz.
And for the survivors, like Lily, they were taken, stripped naked, their worldly possessions lost. They were shorn of all hair. And they were tattooed, the lifelong remembrance on their arms that they were part of this factory process of death.
My great-grandmother always used to show people her tattoo, and as you say, it was a permanent reminder of the Nazis' crimes against humanity. Her number read A10572, and I remember the first time that I actually realised that she was a survivor. I grew up always knowing that she had survived the Holocaust, but I didn't really know what that meant. And the first memory in my head of her telling me her testimony and showing me that number was on a Friday night dinner. We never used to speak about the Holocaust on Friday nights. That was our sacrosanct moment as a family to spend time with our great-grandmother and speak about nice things, because my great-grandmother throughout the week would go out to schools and share her harrowing testimony. And my friend came round, he was a year above me in school, and he had just started learning about the Holocaust and the tattoo numbers in Auschwitz. So he said to my great-grandmother, "Can I see your number?" And I remember her slowly lifting up her left sleeve, showing him on her left arm her number. And he then said to her, "Do you hate?" And she replied, "No, I don't hate, because hate only breeds hate, but love breeds love. And I've seen where hatred can lead to, and hatred can lead to places like the gas chambers, can lead to people dehumanizing people like myself, and that's why they gave me this number." And my great-grandmother always wanted people to learn where that dehumanization can lead to, because ordinary people were part of a system that murdered 6 million. These weren't monsters. We often refer to Dr. Mengele as the angel of death, but ultimately these were educated human beings, scientists, lawyers, accountants, doctors, people who had professions, who went to university, and they then were able to take part in a system, as I said earlier, that murdered 6 million innocent Jewish men, women and children. And the way they were able to do that, the way that neighbours were able to turn on their neighbours, or ordinary people were able to become willing executioners, was because of basic hatred and dehumanisation built up over years through caricatures, through propaganda, and through basic hatred. And that basic hatred is available at people's fingertips today on social media. And so we need to ensure that we are telling young people the truth about what happened in the Holocaust and where that hatred started and where it can lead to.
Dov Foreman, great-grandson of the Auschwitz survivor Lily Ebert. We really appreciate your time and your message this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. So that enormous tent, as you can see in the distance there, we just caught a glimpse of those famous gates at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz itself sprawls over some 500 acres. There are 3 main camps. The main camp, Auschwitz I, where you see that famous sign, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, the idea that those who were fit enough would be set to work, slave labour, some of them who were involved in pulling the bodies out of the gas chamber to burn them, or to sort through clothes, or save gold from people's dental records. Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is where this is taking place, where we are speaking to you, was really the extermination camp, extended with more crematoria, particularly for the Hungarian Jews we heard Dov talking about so movingly there. It was extended to deal with the Hungarian Jews, as the camp commandant would say. And then the third camp, Monowitz, is the slave labour camp. Many key parts of German industry would move there to use that slave labour to their advantage. But the life expectancy there, and indeed at the camp huts behind me, was very short. Well, also at Birkenau for us is our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins. And really, Birkenau was the centre of death in the sprawling camps, some 50 of them, that make up Auschwitz. Siobhan.
That's exactly right. And when you look behind me, you can see really well the extent of this camp, an extension of the main camp when the Nazis wanted to up the brutally efficient methods of killing people, of mass murder, which they had developed. And this complex is the size of a city, but it was a city specifically designed for death, whether that was shooting people, starving people, working people to death, or of course, as we saw particularly here in Birkenau, people being sent to the gas chambers, many not even getting off the train and spending a day here, some being sent straight there, particularly the young, the old, women, people who were pregnant, people who the Nazis saw no value in because they couldn't work. And like you, in the run-up to this anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I've been speaking to survivors, and I spoke to one man who is a 99-year-old. In a few weeks, he'll be 100. He hasn't got the strength, both emotionally and physically to return here. He said he came back to Auschwitz once, and in his words, once was enough. But he will be sitting with his memories today because he lost 41 of his family in the Holocaust, and his parents were brought straight here and murdered on arrival. He, his brother and sister were brought here and amazingly managed to survive. Now, he was one of those sent to Auschwitz III to carry out slave labour. And he said that every day they would be given a tiny piece of bread, which they'd have to try and cut into as many little slices as possible to share around. But it deliberately wasn't enough food for people to do that back-breaking work with. But the Nazis didn't care because, in his words, they weren't people. They were less than animals. They were useful to them until they could work no more. And when you looked too ill or you had sores on your bodies, the guards would look at you, write down your number, and the next day you were sent to the gas chamber. As he said to me, Jews were really only for the chimneys. And the strength that we will see, these 50 survivors have to return here because they are so determined that the memory of what happened here shouldn't be forgotten, is something really remarkable.
Well, survivors are there in the crowds now outside the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Educators, I know, have also been invited, those who are working, bringing young people to Auschwitz to learn the lessons. I overheard one man who's been bringing German students, for example, for the last 20 years, describing how hard it is. And in fact, there we are. There is the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, arriving. We know the German President Steinmeier is also there today. So let's bring in our events commentator, Alistair Bruce. And the dignitaries just arriving now, and really, you know, the European continent, so affected by both the Holocaust and the German invasion of their own nations, is well represented here today, Alistair.
This is a profound day for all those gathered, particularly those representing nations, as you say, particularly from Europe. But there are representatives of nations from all over the world. And for the Chancellor of Germany, there is a profound burden because his nation is where the ideas evolved that led to this extraordinary scene of murder here at Auschwitz. And it is not to drag over any of the elements of how, again, one can try to summarize the tragedy of this. It is to do more than that. It is to try and make sure that through remembering, while those survivors are still amongst those coming here, there is the chance to remind how hate can develop in human life, how it can compel whole populations into a frame of mind that could lead, as it did between 39 and 45, to the systematic murder of a race. And it was here at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the second of the two camps, where specifically Rudolf Höss, the commandant, set about ensuring the manufacture of death, the delivery of utter misery for those who had to make it happen in the form of those prisoners who were selected in order to carry out the task and deal with the dead and make sure that this mechanics of total horror were managed right through until this time, 80 years ago, when approaching noises of the front of the Russian Red Army came close, with very little resistance left from those Nazis still here at Birkenau. But at 3 o'clock, those soldiers finally pushed back the hate and were able to bring a form of relief to those 7,000 survivors who were still clinging on just a smattering of life whilst surrounded by the corpses of so many of their friends and their relations and their race.
We saw the London Mayor Sadiq Khan in the audience. I saw Lord Pickles, who I spoke to a short time ago as well there as the world leaders start to arrive. Just a reflection on the survivors there today. Around 50 is what we've been told. But they're wearing neckerchiefs, Alistair, with the symbol on them that the Germans gave them, the SS guards who looked after them. If you had an upturned red triangle, you were a political prisoner. If it was a P in the centre, you were a Polish political prisoner. If you were a Jehovah's Witness, it was purple. You know, everybody was labelled, tattooed, dehumanised. It was part of the way, I suppose, of controlling them. And the SS guards were, as we know, so cruel to all of them.
It was imperative for the system to create hate in those who were the jailers. And it was part of the manifest theory of what had created the SS, who were given the responsibility of carrying out Himmler's and Hitler's orders. And yet it was to recall all of that generations later, there is a desire to make sure that it is remembered, that the capacity of inhumanity is recognised, and that it is, in its own way, seen as a warning. It is, after all, this place, a warning to everyone who chooses to look. And we see all those neck scarves there that you're talking about, the blue and white uniforms, the stripes, and the reflective badges of whatever it was that those survivors had been labelled with. We know also that their arms will be tattooed with their numbers and that they were treated in that manner. And one moment on the whim of an SS guard could lead to any one of these people having lost the life that they cling on to still today and represent so much of the 1,100,000 people who perished here at Auschwitz.
The German president there, as you can see, Alistair, and I was saying that this educator who'd brought people for the last 20 years, German students, to Auschwitz, suggested that in Germany they are so well taught about the mistakes of their own history. And he had reflected that actually we don't necessarily do that in the UK, but that the Germans do learn about the Great War and the Second World War and what happened to Europe during this time. But as you say, very difficult to listen to the voices of the survivors, which we'll have in the next few minutes for the German Chancellor and the German President. Reflecting on this being in Poland, Poland obviously invaded by Germany on the 1st of September, Alistair, 1939. It triggered the World War. But it was here in Poland that so many Jewish people lost their lives.
The plan Hitler had was to create what was called Lebensraum. This was land which was room for the Germanic peoples in order to find fresh opportunities. And those who lived here were going to be slave labour for the success of the Aryan imperialist takeover. As President Zelensky, who of course from Ukraine, amongst the Red Army who arrived here 80 years ago, were a number of the Ukrainian soldiers who were working as part, fighting as part of the Soviet Red Army at that time. So he not only represents his own faith, being a Jew himself, but he represents some of the horrific things that were done to and by people from Ukraine. And it is again his experience to be at war in Europe now that there is an echo of this past time that we look back on of the Second World War. He will, along with all those here, take part in the Commemoration event, which will start at 3 o'clock, precisely the time when the Red Army came and opened the gates and liberated the awestruck survivors. It will start with music. There will be 4 pieces of music to separate, first of all, the welcome address. There will then be the main 3 addresses by Auschwitz survivors. More music will follow, an address on behalf of the Auschwitz Museum's major donors, and a word of thanks from Dr. Piotr Krimensky. Then the final piece of music, which will lead into, very elegantly, the Jewish liturgy of the Mourner's Kaddish and Psalm 42, after which those who have gathered here will get the chance, particularly the heads of state and the representative of the delegations, to come forward and meet those survivors who represent all those who lost their lives and the myriad who did survive, but who have died in the years since the end of the Second World War. Many of the Sonderkommando, who were those charged to drag the dead from the gas chambers into the crematoria day after day, transport after transport. Those people who themselves were often shot right at the end. Those people who lived through all of that, many of whom, including Primo Levi, the great writer, who tried to expunge the agony and pain of what he had lived through. He took his own life in the end. And, you know, with Europe in the dire state that it faces, with war on its edge, again, this is a time of contemplation for a world who must remember how easy it was for Hitler to create one race to blame for everything that was wrong with post-First World War Germany. And he engineered that. And ultimately, those lieutenants of his aspiration created the final solution. And this is where the final solution reached its most effective delivery.
And Hitler did that instantly, really, from 1933, but incrementally. First of all, stopping Jews, for example, from working in government offices, stopping them becoming lawyers, and eventually expunging them, some of them fleeing, we know, to places like Holland, where they settled, in Amsterdam. And there is the Polish president arriving, Andrzej Duda. He's already been at Auschwitz I, the main camp, to pay tribute at what they called the Wall of Death, where right from the beginning, political prisoners were brought out and shot at the base of their skull. The French President Emmanuel Macron, alongside his wife as well, also greeting some of those who were there. We also saw earlier Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, too, the world leaders who have decided it is so important to come to mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of this camp that really came to symbolize the death that was wrought upon the Jewish people and others who did not agree with Hitler. Hitler set out to wipe out those who politically opposed him, part of his efforts, therefore, to stay in power and to get that Lebensraum that he talked about, the living room. He thought it was the right of Germany to move east. His great hate Jewish people and communists as well, as he invaded the Soviet Union, and thereby more Jews were killed too.
The King and Queen of Denmark have arrived, and they represent, of course, a nation along with the King of Spain. But Denmark was very proud of having managed to secret away so many of their Jews to Sweden. For the King, this has been a profound visit to representing the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth here, to also recall his parents' generation, as so many of them who faced the challenges of the Second World War, and his grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, who in Greece hid a Jewish family in her house in enormous danger to herself throughout the Second World War. She was a member of the Greek royal family. She was known as Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and she lived in Athens and proceeded to hide away one Jewish family for the period of the war. So most of the heads of state now gathered here underneath this tent, which has been placed here so that all those present, the President of France and the King of Spain there. But there are, dressed in their blue and white scarves, the survivors of this horror, who have come here marked with their labels presented to them in such awful circumstances by the hate of a period of German history that must never happen again.
It is just after 3 o'clock. We are watching the commemoration of Auschwitz and the liberation by the Soviet Red Army on this day 80 years ago. Some 50 survivors have gathered at that commemorative event alongside world leaders. We've just seen King Charles and other global heads of state as well. The French President arriving too, alongside the German President and the German Chancellor, to pay homage to those who survived and to remember those who did not. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the place where most of the killing here happened. 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz. 1.1 million died. 1 million of those were Jewish.
This act of commemoration at Auschwitz on the 80th anniversary of its liberation begins with music by Simon James, a German Jewish composer who, living in Berlin, trained in Berlin and taught there, but escaped from Germany when he saw the dangers that were growing with the extremist politics that was dividing the nation. He went to Amsterdam, and there he was captured. With all the music and his capabilities and all that he had given to the world, he was brought here to Auschwitz in one of the railway transports. And within a short time of alighting from the cattle truck on the 12th of October 1944, he was murdered here, and we let his music speak. This is his lament. The welcome address will be given by an Auschwitz survivor, Marian Turski.
Spotykamy się dziś przed bramą wjazdową do Birkenau.
Here today at the gate to Birkenau. Standing before us is a railway wagon, a symbol of the suffering of all the victims of the Auschwitz concentration camp and extermination center. In particular, it is a reference to the tragic transports of the Hungarian Jews in 1944, the climax of the operation of this horrible place. This wagon was placed here on this very ramp 15 years ago as a symbol, thanks to the generous support of Frank Lowy. May the silent emptiness of this wagon be filled today with our living memory of all those who perished in Auschwitz. It is my honor to extend a warm welcome to the survivors. May I welcome their majesties, presidents, prime ministers, and all the heads of national delegations. May I welcome representatives of the Polish Parliament and parliamentarians from across Europe and around the world. I welcome members of the diplomatic corps. I welcome the benefactors who have contributed to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation Perpetual Fund, the Pillars of Remembrance. I welcome representatives of churches and religious communities, including Jewish communities and organizations as well as the Roma community. I welcome representatives of regional and local authorities. I welcome all representatives of institutions and organizations and all the persons in attendance who have come to today's commemoration. May I ask for a welcome on behalf of the survivors. I'm asking Marian Turski, who survived Auschwitz and is a member of the International Auschwitz Council.
Marian Turski, who was 14 when he was forced with his parents and younger brother into the Lodz ghetto, then deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in August of 1944. He survived the death march to Buchenwald in January 1945, just before Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated, and was then sent to a second death march. Sick with typhus, he was finally liberated by the Soviet army, a young boy who now speaks to us as an older man.
W imieniu wszystkich
On
ocalałych
behalf of all the survivors,
witam dostojnych gości.
I welcome the
Witam
distinguished
wszystkich
guests.
zgromadzonych w tym
I welcome
namiocie.
all who have gathered here in this tent.
Witam słuchaczy i
I
widzów
welcome those
środków
who are listening to us
masowego
on the
przekazu.
radio and who watch us on TV and
Ale
in all the other
przede
media.
wszystkim
However,
najgorętsze
first and
myśli
foremost,
i uczucia mam dla was,
towards you,
moi towarzyszki,
my
towarzysze
fellows,
niedoli,
men and women
więźniarki
who have shared this
więźniowie.
misery with me, the inmates.
Dziś obchodzimy
Today
Międzynarodowy
we
Dzień
commemorate
Pamięci
the International
Holocaust.
Day
International
of Remembrance
Holocaust Remembrance Day. Jest
of the
rzeczą
victims of the Holocaust.
zrozumiałą,
It
nawet
is absolutely
oczywistą,
understandable,
że ludzie
if not downright
że media
obvious,
do
that
nas
people,
się zwracają,
that the media
do tych,
turn to us,
którzy ocaleli,
to those who
abyśmy
survived,
podzielili się z nimi,
so that we
wspomnieniami.
shared with them
Ale
our memories.
nas była zawsze
However,
maleńka
there's
mniejszość.
always been a
Nas,
very small minority of
którzy
us
przeszliśmy w swoim
Us
czasie pozytywne selekcje,
went through all those selections
już było
positively.
bardzo, bardzo niewielu.
That
A tych
number itself was very little. And those who lived to see freedom, there were hardly none. So few. And now there is only a handful.
Dlatego sądzę,
Such a small bevy.
że nasze
That is why I believe that our thoughts
powinniśmy skierować
should now
olbrzymiej
go
większości,
towards this huge majority,
milionom ofiar,
those millions of victims
które nigdy nam nie powiedzą, co
who
przeżywali,
will never tell us
czuły,
what they experienced, what they felt,
ponieważ pochłonęła
just
je
because
zagłada.
they were consumed by that mass
Zachował się
destruction,
wszakże
the Shoah.
pewien dokument,
However, there is a certain
Dokument.
document that has survived. A document, a poem,
który w jakimś stopniu
that to a particular
coś
degree
tam mówi nam o tych właśnie ludziach.
tells us something
Jest to,
about those very people.
zapamiętajcie Państwo nazwisko.
And do remember the name.
Łazowert.
It's by Henryka Łazowert. Henryka
Była
Łazowert.
nawet była polską poetką.
She was a Polish poetess.
Nawet bardzo udane próby
She
literackie.
had very successful attempts at
Miała
writing literature.
możliwość ukrycia się,
She had an opportunity to hide beyond the walls of the ghetto, but she was loath
dzisiaj
to leave her mother behind. Today, when I
wydaje mi się,
listen
jakby to było coś poza
to her
sezonowego,
poem,
zupełnie
I find it as something that goes absolutely beyond any
dokument.
thing that the mind can imagine. This is
Mamy jej
a
zdjęcie.
document.
Była
We have a photo
urodziwą kobietą.
of Henryka.
Miała
She
lat
was a beautiful woman.
33. Była już
She was 33.
uznaną poetką.
By that time, she had been a recognized poet, a Polish poet. She wrote in Polish,
Jako
and
Żydówka skazana
as a Jewess,
została na zagładę.
she was sentenced to
Miała
annihilation.
szansę ukrycia się po tak zwanej
She had an opportunity to find a hiding place on the so-called Aryan side,
matki.
but she didn't want to
Napisała
leave her mother. She wrote a letter
do swojego
a poem
przyjaciela.
to her friend.
Zacytuję ten list.
Let me quote that letter.
Odjeżdżam gdzieś tam, bardzo
I'm going
daleko,
somewhere
do
there,
stacji
to a very
nieznajomej,
distant place,
której nie ma
a station that is unknown, for it is not in any map.
Niebo wisi
There is the sky hanging over the station like a huge black lid. The engine shrieks with the voice of a beaten man. The train drivers have the faces of paper. All I have with me is just one suitcase and one grief that no one's ever tried to plummet. I'm so very composed, and what you cannot see at all, so very sad. Be healthy, my distant. There are hearts where nothing changes. I am no longer. No longer. May I ask all the present to stand up for a moment's silence?
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Drodzy przyjaciele,
Dear
od co
friends,
najmniej 2000 lat
for at least 2000 years
naszej cywilizacji
of our civilization,
wizja
we've been accompanied by a vision of apocalypses.
Oto pojawiają się 4 jeźdźcy apokalipsy.
Here, the 4 riders of apocalypse arrive: war, pestilence, hunger, and death.
Ludzie są porażeni strachem.
People are perplexed with fear, paralyzed with that fear.
Całkowicie
And
bezradni.
they feel absolutely helpless.
Co robić?
What can be
Chciałbym
done?
tutaj zacytować,
At this point, I would like to quote
którą na pewno
a song
wielu
that certainly many of you
gdybym ją
would
zanucił.
recognize
Nie ma
if
obawy.
I hummed the
Nie będę
tune.
śpiewał.
But don't worry, I'm not
Ale
going to sing.
Chcę
But
zwrócić
all I
uwagę
want is
na
to draw your attention
tekst
to the lyrics,
niesłychanie inspirujący,
because these lyrics are exceptionally inspiring.
którego autorem jest
The author of the lyrics is
Rabbi Nachman z
Rabbi
Bratslawia,
Nachman of
ale
Bratslav,
znany bardziej jako
who was
Rabbi
better known
Nachman
as
z Humania,
Rabbi Nachman
ponieważ
of
tam
Humain,
kazał się
because that
pochować
was where he
między
had his
grobami
body buried
ofiar pogromu.
among the graves of the victims of a pogrom.
Kol ha'olam kulo. Cały nasz świat, nasz świat.
All our world, the whole world we have,
Czarnoc jest niczym
is
bardzo
nothing,
wąski.
a very narrow bridge.
Kar. A co najważniejsze,
and which is most important,
klal. Nie bać się wcale.
one must not be afraid at all.
A więc nie bać się.
Thus, not to be
W świecie
afraid,
współczesnym
we see
dzisiaj,
in the contemporary world
teraz, wielki
today
wzrost
and
antysemityzmu.
now,
A to
we see a
przecież
huge rise in
właśnie
anti-Semitism,
doprowadził
and that
do
is
Holokaustu.
precisely anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust.
Nazwała
Deborah
to
Lipstadt
tsunami
called it
antysemityzmu. A to
the
właśnie
tsunami of
jej
anti-Semitism,
odwaga, jej
and it was
i
her
wytrwałość
courage,
przed
her
zaprzeczaniem
tenacity
Holokaustu,
in
czyli
fighting with
denial
Holocaust
of the
denial,
Holocaust,
which in English is called the denial of the Holocaust,
zakończyła się sukcesem
put
po wygranym
an end
w
to it.
Londynie
It ended in a success after she won a trial against David Irving
Nie
in London.
bójmy się wykazać takiej
Let
samej
us not
odwagi
fear
dzisiaj, gdy
demonstrating
Hamas
the same courage
czyni
today
próby
when Hamas
zaprzeczania masakry
attempts at
7
denial
października.
of the massacre of the 7th of
Nie
October.
bójmy się
Let us
przeciwstawiać
not
teoriom
oppose
spiskowym, że wszystko,
the
co złe
conspiration
na świecie,
theories
jest skutkiem
saying that all the evil of this world
spisków.
results from a
Nieokreślone
plot
grupy
started by
społeczne,
some
a
indefinite
Żydzi
social
są
groups,
tu często
and Jews
wymieniani.
are often
Nie
mentioned as one
bójmy
of
się
such.
rozmawiać
Let us not
o
fear
problemach, jakie
discussing
dręczą
the
tak
problems
zwane
that
ostatnie
torment
pokolenie.
the so-called last
Naruszają
generation.
Co prawda ci młodzi ludzie, nasz
These
porządek
young
społeczny,
people may
nasz
disturb our
system
social order.
prawny,
They may disturb
ale
our system
sędzia,
of truth.
który wydał
Yet,
wyrok, wypowiedział
whether the judge
zamienne
has pronounced
słowa.
the
Być może
sentence when he
dziś
uttered those memorable
wskazują
words, perhaps
jutrzejszych
today
bohaterów.
I sentence tomorrow's heroes.
Nie bójmy się przekonywać
Let us not
samych
be afraid
siebie,
to
można
convince
rozwiązywać
ourselves
problemy
that we
między
can
sąsiadami.
solve problems
Od setek
between
lat
neighbors,
na różnych
because for
kontynentach,
centuries,
różne
on many
narody,
continents,
narodowości
many nations,
lub
many
grupy
peoples,
etniczne
and many
mieszkały
ethnic groups
i żyły
have lived
obok siebie
and
i
have
między sobą.
had their homes
Uprzedzenia
among
wzajemne,
one another
hejtowanie,
and between one another.
nienawiść
All
doprowadzały
the
do
hatred,
konfliktów
all the
zbrojnych
hate speech
między
led
tymi
to armed conflicts
sąsiadującymi
between
narodami
those
i grupami
neighboring
etnicznymi.
peoples and ethnic groups.
Kończyło się to zawsze
That
przelewem
always
krwi.
ended in
Ale
bloodshed.
są na szczęście doświadczenia
Yet, luckily,
pozytywne,
there are the
gdzie
positive
obie
experiences
strony
as well,
dochodzą
when
do wniosku,
both the
że nie
sides
mają innego
reach a
sposobu
conclusion that they have
zapewnienia
no other way
spokojnego,
of ensuring
bezpiecznego
a peaceful,
życia
safe and
swoim
secure
dzieciom,
life
wnukom,
for their children,
przyszłym pokoleniom,
grandchildren, and for the future generations, then leading to a
Powołam się
compromise.
na dwa przykłady z
Let me
Europy.
quote here two examples
Niemcy
from
i Francuzi,
Europe, Germans
Polacy i
and the
Litwini.
French, Poles and
Powtórzę.
Lithuanians.
Nie bójmy
Let me
się
reiterate,
przekonać
let us not
samych siebie,
fear convincing ourselves that one needs to have a vision not only of what is here today, but also what is going to come tomorrow and what will come in several decades. Thank you for your attention.
The response to the profound witness of Marian Turski, who was 14 when he came down the railway line that divides this gathering and entered Auschwitz as a boy. He represents the International Auschwitz Council today and has introduced with his welcoming address the context for contemplation. We now move on to the music of Józef Kopryński, which is called Longing. He came here to Auschwitz after being captured by the Gestapo and imprisoned in November 1941. He was made to play in the camp orchestra, which played to those who were being taken to their murder in the gas chambers. He was appointed first violinist and was later taken on to Buchenwald. He managed to compose 10 pieces while he was a prisoner and hid them away. And one of those will be played today in order to reflect upon this moment and that introduction. He decided when he was liberated by American troops in 1945 not to touch music again. So this statement from his pen lifts the thoughts of everyone here now. There will now be 3 main addresses by Auschwitz survivors.
Now, let
O
us
zabranie
listen
głosu proszę
to the
ocalałą z
witnesses.
obozu Auschwitz,
May I ask
panią
a
Janinę Iwańską.
survivor, Ms. Janina Iwańska, to take the floor.
Marek Zajac, who is the host of today's International Auschwitz Council contribution to this event, introducing their Janina Iwańska. In August 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, she lived in Wola, a district where the slaughter of civilians was carried out. For her to come and encompass a lifetime of survival, she will bring to this moment the pain of her memories and the anguish of her desire for a better world.
Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, half a year ago, in June, I was here to commemorate the first transport of inmates to Auschwitz. These were Polish inmates that had been moved here from Tarnów. 728 people altogether. This was the 84th anniversary of the first transport. This is the 80th anniversary of the camp liberation, when the camp stopped its operation. 4.5 years, this is how the camp operated. Now, this camp changed significantly. Originally, it was a camp for political prisoners, people who were not happy with German occupation. These were mostly Poles, mostly adults. Then, Poles were no longer allowed to form associations, including scouting. This is when younger people, boys, would be moved here, teenage boys, for their activity in the scouting, Polish scouting movement. So, for a time, most of the inmates were Poles here. Then, this camp turned into a camp for Soviet POWs. Tens of thousands of POWs were moved here. But these were not, or rather this camp became a labor camp. So firstly, in August, those Russians and Poles would become subjects. They were used to test various killing gases to see which gas would be the most efficient. Then in September 1941, those Soviet POWs that survived were moved to Brzezinka, the village of Brzezinka. This is where we are, and this is where, when then started building the Birkenau camp. And they worked throughout a very heavy winter. Remember, winters here were truly tragic. Lots of poverty, lots of very hard work and little to eat. If you disliked anything, you would be killed. March 1942, this is when the camp was commissioned. 12,000 survivors were moved here, but only 500 survived. Once Birkenau was ready, women would be brought in, because until that point there had been no women. Women from Poland and from all over Europe. Belgians, French, Czech, Romanian women, and most of them were Polish. Now, the operators of the camp, which gas worked the best, which is when they started building gas chambers. In autumn, they started the construction of the gas chambers and the crematoria. April next year, the crematoria were ready, so were the gas chambers. And that is when it was no longer a POW camp, a Soviet camp. This is when the killing machine started its operation. This is when the killing factory started its operation. All they would do here would be killing people. Some people would be moved to other camps, but most would be exterminated. It is difficult to calculate all the people killed here. Most would be registered, marked, but many a time inmates, people would be brought in here from other countries, and they would be driven directly to gas chambers and crematoria. It is calculated that around 1 million Jews were murdered this way. So they would be taken directly from the ramp to the gas chambers. Nobody knows exactly how many people died here. Now, the year was 1943. Apart from Jews and Aryan people from all over Europe and other continents, including Asia and North America, they would bring in Roma. They called it the gypsy camp. Roma and Sinti would be put there. They called it the family camp. Families would be brought in here, Roma with their wives and children. Dr. Mengele would take care of them. Even before the war, Mengele actually had conducted experiments aimed at proving that the German race was superior. All the others were inferior, and the Jews and the Roma were basically inhuman, so they should be exterminated. The Roma were brought in here in whole families because he specialized in conducting experiments on children. Where you had a family, there were also children then, and they, or rather them, he would experiment on newborns, on babies. Many Roma died here because of diseases, misery. Now, in August 1943, there were as many as 4,000 Roman Sinti living there. There was this night of the 3rd. They were all taken directly to gas chambers. In the morning, on the next day, not a single living Roma or Sinti was there, because Mengele had completed his experiments and he no longer needed the material to work on. So it was August 1944, close to the end of the war. That is when the uprising broke out. On the 1st of August, it was an uprising against the Germans. The Germans were to leave the city because the Soviets, the Russians, were on the other side of on the other bank of the river. Poles rose because they wanted to win the capital, but the Germans would return and started destroying the capital. They were given orders to flatten the city. All the inhabitants of the city were to be exterminated. In the first 6 days, in the district of Wola, 50,000 civilians were killed. They would be dragged out of their homes and flats and shot on the street. Their houses would be set on fire. I lived in the very same neighborhood, so a bit later they would be there too. A special camp was set up close to Warsaw. The houses would be set on fire, people would be brought to this camp in Pruszków, a temporary camp, and segregation would take place there. Those who couldn't work would be taken first to Germany for forced labor, and then they would be moved to concentration camps. August the 12th, this is when I was transported here to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Tens of thousands of Varsovians were moved here. Many women were moved to Ravensbrück and men to Buchenwald and other camps in Germany. Also, here, So what are we celebrating today? We are celebrating the liberation. This is when the camp stopped its operation. When it happened, there were few inmates. The Germans were truly perfidious. You could hear the shots of approaching frontline, and yet they decided to take the inmates out of the camp and move them elsewhere. So those that had stayed were the sick, the young, pregnant women. So when the camp was liberated, basically only 5 to 10% of inmates were liberated. 100,000 inmates were taken out of here. They were forced on the death march to Wodzisław Śląski and then to other camps. Ravensbrück and one more camp were my stopovers, so I was liberated truly later. People use this expression, prison or concentration camp. It seems innocuous. People were kept there, but the thing is, this camp had been undergoing a number of metamorphoses until it moved into a killing site. I would like to read a quote to you. The war finished in 1945. People all over the world were in euphoria. Never again was the slogan. People believed that the war would never happen again. Picasso painted this dove of peace. And yet, there were people who made certain predictions. They predicted that it is impossible for these things never to happen again, because people became so inhuman that it might happen again. In 1950, a Polish writer and essayist wrote something about the war. Now, he wrote a lot about the war and war in general. He published these articles, these columns, and let me read out to you his words. He wrote the following: if Europe, ravaged by these follies, is to avoid destruction, its people must learn to anticipate better the consequences of their actions. They must not disregard those who possess such foresight. For the older generation, this may be of lesser concern. My thoughts are with the young, those who have their lives ahead of them. War and chaos can erupt anywhere, leaving no place or reason to flee. Thank you very much.
Janina Iwanska, speaking absolutely from the heart there, the first of the Auschwitz survivors to give their addresses today.
Szanowni Państwo, o zabranie głosu proszę ocalałą z obozu Auschwitz, panią Tove Friedman.
Ms. Tove Friedman, Auschwitz survivor, to take the floor.
Tove Friedman was only 5 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz, amazingly, because children were really not allowed to survive past inspection. She managed to survive by a miracle. At the end of her time here, she hid amongst the corpses with her mother, and on this day, 80 years ago, she survived.
January 27th, my whole life, since I was a little girl, I thought of it as my birthday. This is my birthday, January 27th. I celebrate it every single year. In fact, today I got all kinds of emails. Some of my friends don't even know that I have a regular birthday, because this is what counts. Never did I imagine that I would celebrate this year with such a fabulous audience, so many people, such important people. And it's an honor. It's an honor to be there. It's an honor to address you, and I want to thank you to listen to me, because I represent the children. There are very few of us are left. From my town, 4 children survived. So I'm here to talk about those who aren't here. And I'm very honored to speak to this kind of audience that has come from all over the world to mourn, remember, and honor the memory of our people who were so brutally murdered by the Nazis. However, we are also here to proclaim and to pledge that we will never, never, ever allow history to repeat itself. I would like to share some of my memories, because I know that there are many survivors here who are struggling with their own. I was just 6.5 years old when I was liberated from Auschwitz. But my memories are very vivid, thanks to my mother, who constantly validated the events to me as they were happening. When she was with me, she never, ever covered anything up. I remember, as a 5.5-year-old child, watching from my hiding place in Starchowitz labor camp, as all my little friends were rounded up and driven to their deaths, while the heartbreaking cries of their parents fell on deaf ears. After all the children were gone and the courtyard was empty, I thought to myself, am I the only Jewish child left in the world? Shortly thereafter, we were loaded into cattle cars. The men and women were separated. This was the very first time I ever saw my father cry. Up until then, no matter what horrors, no matter what happened to us, we were together, the 3 of us. We were a family. But now, he was sent to Dachau, and my mother and I here to this camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Hot, hungry, thirsty, and very terrified, I held on tightly to my mother's hand in the dark cattle car for countless hours, while the cries and the prayers of so many desperate women permeated my soul and haunt me to this day. Finally, we arrived at Auschwitz, a gloomy Sunday with a sky obscured by smoke and a terrible stink hung in the air. And there were rows and rows of naked women all around me. What are they looking for? I asked my mother as I too was naked. And I tried to avoid the gleam of the German shepherd's teeth and their eyes. I was their height, so I can see them completely. I can still see their eyes to this day. My mother answered me, diseases. But if we are ill, she didn't have to finish. She pointed to the smoke right by the entrance. I knew at 5.5 what that meant. We all knew. As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for fidgeting, for not being able to stand still for hours at an appel, a roll call, I looked into my mother's eyes. She was standing next to me, silently, and she was pleading with me, don't cry, hold on. And I didn't. I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me. At 5.5, I had the rebellion in me. I will not show them. I will not let them know the pain they're inflicting on me. I am sure that many of you here who are Holocaust survivors have their own memories, and you remember when your entire being rebelled, but you felt powerless, abandoned, so you just had to resign. On an icy, windy day, I stood and watched helplessly as little girls from the nearby barrack were marched away, crying and shivering, to the gas chamber. They were covered with rags, and some of them didn't even have any shoes and were walking barefoot in the snow. They were very young, as I was, 6 or 7, but starvation shrunk their bodies, and they appeared even younger. They too became ashes. Is my barrack next? I silently wondered. I thought that we all have to die, that it was normal. If you're a Jewish child, you have to die. I wasn't even sure what Jewish was, because I never saw any celebrations. But death, child, Jewish, seemed a normal thought. I knew nothing about partisans saving Jews from ghettos and camps. I knew nothing about the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, nor of the Allies and the D-Day, nor of the invasion of Normandy. At that time, we were victims in a moral vacuum. But today, however, We have an obligation not only to remember, which is very, very important, but also to warn and to teach that hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. Instead, our revenge has been to build a strong Jewish country and raise our families in peace. Many of you here, I saw, have your wonderful families with you, just as I do. 80 years after liberation, the world is again in crisis. Our Jewish Christian values have been overshadowed worldwide by prejudice, fear, suspicion, and extremism. And the rampant anti-Semitism that is spreading among the nations is shocking. It's shocking to all of us, to our children and our grandchildren. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is fighting for its very existence and its way of life. We mourn not only the fallen soldiers and the hostages, but also the turbulence and mistrust in our society. We pray for strength, resilience, and of course, hope, which has to be part of our daily life. We all of us, must reawaken our collective conscience to transform this violence, anger, hatred, and malignancy that has so powerfully gripped our society into a humane and just world before these terrible, terrible negative forces will destroy us all. It is an enormous task, but our Jewish sages teach us the time is short, the task is great. We may not be able to complete it, but we have an obligation to start. Thank you.
Eva Friedman there, who is 86, but says that her birthday was 80 years ago when liberation came, so she's 80 years old, telling us the story of her existence. About being a young girl, aged 5, looking straight into the eyes of a German shepherd dog, same height as her, and then explaining that she was a victim in a moral vacuum. The third of the talks will be given by Dr. Leon Weintraub. He also came here to Auschwitz as a young man, and his memories too will illuminate, finally, this place.
Drodzy I bardzo mi bliscy, ocaleni z tego nazistowskiego obozu koncentracyjnego.
Of the Nazi concentration camp,
Szanowni przedstawiciele władz państwowych,
distinguished representatives of governmental, organizational and religious authorities, dear guests from near and far. I was born in Łódź on the 1st of January 1926, so I am 99 years old. After my father's death, when I was just 18 months, this was 1927, my mother converted all available resources into capital, and she opened a small laundry business at Kamienna Street, which is now Włókiennicza Street. And then the entire family, comprising of my mother and her 5 children, we occupied just 2 small rooms. This is where we lived, and this is where she worked. Now, I started my primary school, and I was a good student. So, after the 6th grade, I got admitted free of charge to a Pilsudski gymnasium at Sienkiewicza Street in Łódź. And I was about to start my further education on the 1st of September, 1939. Now, the invasion of our country by the Nazi army disrupted these plans. And in the winter of 1940, we were forcibly moved to the ghetto Litzmannstadt that the Nazis established. While in the ghetto, I worked in the Metal 1 department, and I spent there almost 5 years. 5 years of hard labor and constant hunger. In August 1944, the liquidation of the ghetto began, and we were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother and her sister, my auntie Eve, were murdered on the same day in the gas chamber, and then they were burned in the crematorium. And then we were stripped of all our humanity. First, we were stripped naked and robbed of all our personal belongings. Then they brutally shaved all our hair, quite often with painful skill removal, which was so painful when carbolic fluid was used to disinfect. And then we were dressed in rags, trousers, shirts, jackets, and then clogs, wooden clogs. This is how we were reduced to mere disposable items. I suffered a lot. I felt utterly alone. I was so brutally separated from my family. I also suffered because of this constant black smoke, reeking of burnt flesh, that was rising from the chimneys. This was particularly maddening. After a few weeks, I managed to sneak out illegally of Auschwitz-Birkenau, unnoticed by the capos and SS men. I joined a group of prisoners who were selected to work outside of the camp. In Birkenau, which was the sub-camp of Gross Rosen, I worked as an electrician. In late February 1945, after a 3-day death march, we were transported to the Flossenburg camp, and then a month later to the Natzweiler Stutthof Offenburg camp. I was liberated by the French troops near Donaueschingen on the 20th of April 1945. As I was diagnosed with general debility, and I only weighed 35 kilos. I was also diagnosed with typhus. I had to be hospitalized for several weeks, first in Donaueschingen, And then I was stationed at the French military sanatorium on the Reichenau Peninsula. In the autumn of 1946, I started my medical studies in Göttingen. I returned to Poland in November 1950, and after graduation in 1954, I worked at the Clinic of Obstetrics and Women's Diseases of the Medical Academy in Warsaw. But owing to rising anti-Semitism in Poland, I lost my job in February 1969, where I was the head of the obstetrics and gynecology department in Otwock Hospital. So in September 1969, I emigrated to neutral Sweden together with my family. Today, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp. This Nazi concentration camp symbolizes the unprecedented cruelty in the treatment of people throughout history. This is a place where the techniques of mass and industrial murder were first introduced. It grieves me deeply to see in many European countries, but also in Poland, Nazi-style uniforms and slogans openly paraded at marches. It grieves me to see that this is happening without any consequences. These people self-proclaim themselves as national champions, but at the same time, they proclaim the hateful ideology of German Nazis. This is the ideology that murdered millions who were considered subhuman under the sign of the swastika. So this ideology, an attitude that preaches hostility and hatred towards others, this defines racism, anti-Semitism and homophobia as virtues. And this is occurring here in our country, which has suffered so much, which has endured extensive damage under the Nazi occupation. I urge all people of goodwill, and especially I ask of the young people, be sensitive to all expressions of intolerance and resentment towards those who are different, regardless of their skin color, religion, or sexual orientation. In today's digital world, it is so incredibly challenging to distinguish between genuine intention and the pursuit of popularity, the need to exist that stems from a conscious and persistent agenda. I repeat, therefore, be attentive and be vigilant. We, the survivors, we understand that the consequence of being considered different is active persecution, the effects of which we have personally experienced. And we did experience it very hard. So let us be very serious, and let's take seriously what the enemies of democracy preach. They generally seek to implement the slogans they promote. If they succeed in gaining power, we must avoid the mistake of the 1930s, when the world failed to take seriously the Nazi regime and the plans to create a state free of Jews, Roma, and people of different opinions, or sick, or those deemed unfit to live, were underestimated. Therefore, I implore everybody to intensify their efforts in countering the views that led to the genocide we are commemorating today. Modern understanding of our heritage and our DNA confirms that there is but only one race of humans, Homo sapiens. Therefore, the theory of racism, which is a fundamental principle of Nazi ideology, is false and incompatible with reality. Let me assure you, as a doctor, as a gynecologist, when I perform operations, whatever the patient's skin, the tissues beneath are identical in every person. Astronomers tell us that there are trillions of solar systems and galaxies, and that are similar to ours. Our planet is merely a speck in the vast cosmos. Isn't it absurd to divide the inhabitants of the speck into thousands of disparate groups that are often and sadly hostile to each other? Every year there are lengthy discussions taking place in parliaments regarding budget cuts. Significant amounts are, however, allocated to armaments. In contrast, the peaceful coexistence of nations could be achieved without any financial cost. Just think about the positive impact this expenditure could create. I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation to the management and all the staff of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum for their tireless efforts in preserving the memory of the victims of the Nazi ideology and for combating prejudice and hostility toward others, while allowing the memory of millions of innocent victims to fade would be equivalent to robbing them of their lives for a second time. The commemoration of the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz serves as a reminder of the inhumane treatment of individuals, but also it is a warning against the increasingly vocal movements of the radical and anti-democratic right. I kindly ask everyone now to stand and observe with a moment of silence the memory of the victims of the degenerate German nationalism. Thank you.
Three witnesses speaking for the survivors and for the cries that come from the ashes of 1.1 million people. To say, this happened, be warned, this can happen again. The third piece of music, a string quartet by the musician Simon Lax, who, a Polish Jew, a composer, musician and translator who was deported to Auschwitz from Paris in 1942 when the transports were sent. And we imagine, as we listen, the witness statements we've heard and try to comprehend the terror and confusion of all those who we see, who we think about, and who today we commemorate at this liberation of Auschwitz.
O zabranie głosu proszę przedstawiciela filarów pamięci, największych prywatnych darczyńców Funduszu na rzecz zachowania autentyzmu Auschwitz-Birkenau, pana Ronalda Laudera.
And Marek Zojak, the host of the International Auschwitz Council, introduces the first of the addresses on behalf of the museum's major donors, Ronald Lauder, chairman of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation. He's also president of the World Jewish Congress and taking his opportunity to start the closing process of this recognition of the 80th anniversary of liberation. Like the others, he will stand beside the cattle truck and remember.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Auschwitz survivors who are with us today. And the leaders of more than 50 countries, royal families, and heads of state who came here today to honor the memory of those who died here. Thank you. Ten years ago, in 2015, Auschwitz survivor Roman Kent stood here on this platform at the 70th anniversary of the liberation, and he said these words: "We don't want our past to be our children's future." Let me repeat that again. We don't want our past to be our children's future. Roman Kent died 6 years later, but his words haunt us today, because if Roman Kent were here and saw what was happening to the Jewish people around the world in 2025, he would cry. It's hard for us to believe what we see today, the sudden violence of hatred against Jews, the singling out of the one Jewish state with huge demonstrations shouting anti-Semitic slurs everywhere. This is hard for us to watch, any of us, but I cannot imagine what it must be like for the almost 50 survivors here who are with us today. What Roman Kent said, and all of you lived through, we are watching right now in front of our eyes. Earlier, you heard Tova Friedman tell a story of watching children separate from their parents and taken to gas chambers. We know that 1.5 million children were killed in the Holocaust, the most heartbreaking number in an ocean of heartbreak. But 15 months ago, not 80 years ago, we saw Jewish children slaughtered once again for one reason: because they were born Jewish. In a very fundamental way, what happened in Israel on October 7th and what happened here at Auschwitz have one common thread: the age-old hatred of Jews. On January 27th, 1945, when the Red Army entered these gates, the world finally saw where the step-by-step progression of anti-Semitism leads. It leads right here. The gas chambers, the piles of bodies, and the horrors within these gates. But what led up to the Holocaust final outcome? It began slowly. First, when Jews were singled out in universities, excluded from jobs, with boycotts and attacks in the media. Yes, it began slowly. And then it happened all at once. Throughout the 1930s, the hatred against Jews may have been ignited by Hitler in Germany and Austria. But in France, Italy, even England and the United States, there were strong forces that supported this hatred. France had Marcel Boucard, Jacques Doriot, and Francois Coty. England had Oswald Mosley. Italy had Mussolini. And the U.S., there was the German Bund. Henry Ford was a huge anti-Semite, as were Father Conklin, and believe it or not, even Charles Lindbergh. Today, we see eerie parallels throughout the world, throughout Europe, North America, even Australia. Jewish students have been singled out and threatened in universities. Today, Jewish professors have been fired. Today, Jewish children have been told to hide any outward signs of being Jewish. Today, there are mass demonstrations against Jews. Today, we see vile comments all over social media. Need I remind you, this is not 1933 or 1939. This is 2025. The hatred of Jews had its willing supporters then, and it has them now. You can't be Jewish or non-Jewish and not be concerned with what you see all around us today. But here, at these gates, we are forced to face one great question when we tell the story of Auschwitz. Everyone knows what happened here, but no one seems to know why it happened. Yes, it was a step-by-step process, and it was aided by those who hated Jews. But it was advanced by the indifference of people who thought they were not affected by anti-Semitism because they were not Jewish. It was the world's silence that led to Auschwitz. When Hitler heard that silence after Kristallnacht in 1938, he knew he could do anything he wanted with the Jews. Kristallnacht may have been on page 1 of some newspapers, but it quickly disappeared. World leaders said nothing. On my first visit here at Auschwitz, I was accompanied by a famous survivor, Elie Wiesel. We were walking away from the gas chambers, and the sun was setting. Elie paused for a moment, and then he said something I will never forget. You know, he said, most people think the opposite of love is hate. It's not. It's indifference. Today it's the same story. Silence, indifference, and the exception of this hatred. So today, all of us must take a pledge to never be silent when it comes to anti-Semitism, or for that matter, any other hatred. These lessons for Auschwitz are not just for Jews, they're for the entire world. That's because Jews are the canaries in the coal mine. When the canary dies, miners know they have to get out of that mine as fast as possible. That canary died 15 months ago on October 7th. And that is the most consequential warning for the entire world. Yes, Hitler went after the Jews first. But when it was all over, more than 60 million human beings were dead. And this continent lay in ruins. Over 1 million Jews were killed here at Auschwitz. But they were not alone. 70,000 Polish Christians who thought they might be safe were also murdered right here, along with the others. When I spoke here 5 and 10 years ago, I talked about the horrors that Jewish survivors lived through. But I always spoke about it in the past. It never occurred to me that this could happen again. Of course, I'm not talking about gas chambers, but attacks on the Jewish people, the boycotts, the targeting, the exclusion could not be more real. And yes, they are really happening. But here is a crucial point. These attacks are not just targeting Jews. They are attacking Judeo-Christian beliefs, which is the bedrock of Western civilization. When we hear the chants like globalized intifada or death to Israel, what they're really saying is death to Western civilization. How do you stop this? Today, we have a generation that is led by social media, indoctrinated by activist teachers, and aided by a complacent population. They're complacent because they don't see it as their problem. But please believe me, it is all of our problems. Today in the U.S., 87% of Americans 30 and over fully support Israel's right to exist, just as every other country has exactly the same numbers. But for Americans under 30, the number drops to 40%. No right to exist? Almost half of all younger Americans don't believe Israel has a right to exist. And they are our future leaders. Let me tell you, this is not just happening in America. It is happening to young people in every single country that is represented here. Just as in my country, young people are getting most of their information from social media, and that is dangerous. Education, serious, honest education, is the only way to correct this, and that won't be easy. Entire institutions will have to be overhauled and corrected, and that goes for the media as well. Keeping opinions out of news would be a good start. So today, I cannot stand here and look at these survivors and say that everything is okay, as I have in the past, because everything is not okay. Roman Kent's words haunt us. So let today be the day we all of us, world leaders and ordinary citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, old and young, make a solemn pledge to stop this now before it's too late. We must, you must, and that's every one of your countries. No hatred of Jewish people or any people is tolerated at all. Remember, it wasn't just Jews that died here. In fact, every single prime minister, president, king here today lost millions of their own countrymen in a war to defeat this hatred. 80 years ago, millions of young men gave up their lives so these gas chambers were turned off forever. That means millions of young men, I should say women, never had the chance to live out their lives, to fall in love, to have families, to do good work, to watch their children grow up. They gave up everything so we would live in a free and safe world. More than 60 million human beings died, 6 million of them Jews. We will never know what the world lost in all these deaths, the cures for disease, the great works of art, music, and literature. So much is lost with each life that was extinguished. Our future, the future of the entire world, depends on which direction young people take. They have a choice to go on the old road of hatred once again, or they can summon up the courage to stand up to these hatreds swirling around them. All of us have a choice as well. We can leave here and go back to our 50 different countries and assume it's not our problem. Or we can leave here united in our determination to stop this hate rising up in our world, united in our determination to guide our young people in the right direction, united as one. I've been involved with Auschwitz for more than 50 years, since the 25th anniversary in 1970. On my first visit, I saw how time elements were taking their toll. I realized that if no efforts were made to preserve Auschwitz, it would soon disappear. So I took upon myself to start that process, to make sure that Auschwitz would stand for all time as the strongest lesson for all humanity. What we see here today reflects what Auschwitz looked like in 1945. So future generations will see and learn the lessons of Auschwitz. And I salute the many people who helped me in this endeavor with the same commitment. I hope Roman Kent is looking at us now, knowing that we do everything in our power to make sure that his warning does not come to pass. Don't worry, Roman. We will fight this hatred with renewed determination. And I firmly believe that the good will triumph in the end. Finally, I would like to convey what this place, Auschwitz, means to me. Not as a survivor, not as a liberator, but simply as a Jew who cared deeply about my fellow Jews. On that first visit here so long ago, I was struck by a thought that every Jew must have when they come to Auschwitz. What if I'd been born in Budapest in 1944, where my grandparents came from, instead of New York, where they settled? What would have happened to me? You all know the answers to that question. I feel a deep personal connection to this place. This platform where over 1 million people arrived. I was drawn to this place. I try to come here as often as possible. Every visit, I would always stop at the train station on Avincian and buy flowers. And then I would find a rock. And I would lay the flowers at the tombstone out there. I would put the rock on top of the memorial that many of us have done for more than 1 million men, women, and children whose souls swirl around us. I would say a special prayer, the prayer you know. I felt then and I feel now. I tie to each one of them. It's hard to explain, but it's profound, and it's a major part of who I am. I've spoken here in past commemorations. Today, I must be realistic. this may well be the last commemoration, and also that I will speak at. But I leave today with the understanding I did my best, I did my utmost to be worthy of the memory of all those who were lost there. I tried my best. Hope I was worthy. God bless the memory, and God bless all of you. Thank you.
And Ronald Lauder there giving his views at this extremely moving reflection on the liberation of Auschwitz 80 years ago as chairman of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation and on behalf of the major donors. And shortly, a word of thanks from Dr. Piotr Sawinski, who is the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and has been since 2006. And 2 years ago, he was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire as a sign of gratitude for all he has done here on behalf of the United Kingdom government. And it's a reminder that each of those taking part represents such a wide population across the world in everything they do. Dr. Piotr Sawinski.
Gdy byłem dzieckiem, mówiłem jak dziecko,
I spoke like a child, felt like a child, and thought like a child.
Kiedy zaś stałem się mężczyzną,
But when I became an adult, I left behind the ways of childhood,
pamięcią.
except for memory.
Bo ona pozostaje z najwcześniejszych nawet doświadczeń.
Memory endures even from the earliest experiences of our lives.
Doświadczenia są tym, co musimy
Today,
dziś przemyśleć.
we must reflect upon memory and experience.
Rozumiałem to dorastając, a
I realized this as I grew up, and most importantly, in this very place. Nowhere else have I matured more. After all, I became aware of Auschwitz thanks to you, and through you, survivors. Every generation needs a lens to evaluate its time. Today, we all stand together, looking at the world through the lens of our adulthood. We must look within ourselves and ask, what have we done with memory? Memory is polyphonic. It both divides and unites generations. It has divided and united me and my own experience too. For 18 years, I have stood here, experiencing both division and unity. We teach history, but this is not the same as teaching memory. History is the knowledge of facts. Memory is the awareness of those facts, which is precisely what we so desperately need today. History does not create trauma. Memory can. Memory is the key to understanding today's world and designing tomorrow's. Yet we continue to focus solely on teaching history, not memory. Our educational programs must be changed. They must. Because memory is not just a matter of culture. It is a matter of clarity, identity. We are standing here with the people who bear responsibility for the world we live in today. Like you, I was born after the war. Like you, I don't remember those times. Like you, I listened to the stories of the survivors. But what am I doing today? And what am I neglecting?
Jakie decyzje podejmuję dziś i czy są
What
one
decisions
podejmowane
do I
na
make
podłożu
today, and are they
pamięci?
guided by memory?
Pamięć boli,
Memory hurts.
pamięć pomaga,
Memory
pamięć
helps.
naprowadza,
Memory
pamięć
guides.
ostrzega,
Memory
pamięć
warns.
uświadamia,
Memory
pamięć
raises awareness.
zobowiązuje.
Memory obliges.
Kim jesteś bez pamięci?
Who are you without memory?
Nie masz doświadczenia,
Without memory, you
ani
have no
punktów
history. You
odniesień.
have no experience and no point of reference.
Jeśli nie masz pamięci, to nawet nie wiesz,
If you
którą
have no
drogę
memory,
wybrać.
you may not know which path to choose.
Ale jeśli naprawdę jej nie masz, to uwierz,
And if you truly lack memory, be
wrogowie
sure
wymyślą ci
your
pamięć.
enemies will design one for you.
No i wy, drodzy,
And you,
ocalali, kochani,
our dear survivors, beloved ones, you have come here.
nasza pamięć jest tak bardzo
Our memory
owocem
is
waszych
primarily
przeżyć,
shaped by our experiences,
owocem waszego życia.
the fruit of your lives.
Nie ma słów, drodzy.
There are
jak
no
za to
words,
wam
dearest
dziękować.
ones, to express the depth of our gratitude.
A co mamy z tym dziś zrobić?
But what are we to do with this memory today?
Przyjacielu,
If today, my friend, you feel
jeśli dziś
uncertain
czujesz się
about what to do,
bezsilny, jeśli dziś nie dajesz
if you
już
feel
rady,
powerless, if you feel
znaczy
you cannot go on,
doszedłeś do granicy.
then
Ale
perhaps
jeśli tak
you
powiedzieć,
have
że granice
reached your
są
limit.
tylko w wyobraźni.
If so,
Zawsze
know that
możesz
limits
więcej.
are only
Zrób
imaginary.
więc zatem coś
You can
dobrego,
always do more.
tak jak potrafisz
Do
najlepiej.
something good then, whatever you can,
Innych, a
in
zobaczysz,
the
że
best
zrobiłeś
way you
to też dla
can.
ciebie.
Do it for
Zrób to
others,
na
and you will
skalę
find that you have
twoich
done it for yourself as well. Do
Ale
it
zrób.
within the scope of your abilities.
Wyzdrowiejesz z
But do something.
bezsilności, z apatii.
Act,
Zrób.
and you will recover from feelings of helplessness
zawsze
and apathy.
Pamiętaj.
Take action. Begin.
Niech wreszcie twoja pamięć
But
zacznie
always
żyć.
remember,
Dziś
let your memory finally come alive
Bo
today,
to właśnie pamięć
because your
twoją
memory
podporą,
is your
twoją
pillar,
pomocą,
your
twoim
aid,
przeczuciem,
your instinct,
tobą.
yourself.
The music lullaby brings to an end the reflections of those who not only survived Auschwitz, but who have been committed to protecting it as a focus for remembering what was done here. At the end of this music that was written by Gideon Klein, who perished at Group, one of the sub-camps, which was a place where coal mining was done, the music echoing a lullaby that he recalled and who quietly wrote this while he lived here. We will then move on to perhaps the most important part of this commemoration. And whatever faith you have or whatever thoughts you have been reflecting on, we will hear the Mourner's Kaddish, which is part of the Jewish liturgy, followed by Psalm 42 from the Bible. Both of them would have brought great comfort to those who endured life here and for whom death was so constant a battle.
Szanowni Państwo, oddajmy teraz hołd ofiarom Auschwitz. Zapraszam do wspólnej modlitwy za pomordowanych.
Please join us in a joint prayer for those who were murdered in Auschwitz.
Do odmówienia modlitwy Kadisz zapraszam rabinów.
Kaddish
Naczelnym
will be
rabinem Polski
recited
na czele.
by the rabbis, including the chief rabbi of Poland.
מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים. המצאנו נכון תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים טהורים, כזורקי המסירים, לנשמות אחינו בני ישראל הקדושים והטהורים, שנפלו בידי הרוצחים, ונשפך דמם באושוויץ, טרבלינקה, מיידניק, סוביבור, בלז'ץ, חלמנו ובשאר מחנות השמדה ועבודה וגטאות באירופה, שנהרגו ושנשרפו ושנשחטו ושנקברו חייהם בכל מיתות משונות ואכזריות על קדושת השם, בעבור שאנחנו בניהם ובנותיהם, אחיהם ואחיותיהם, מתפללים על הזכרת נשמותיהם בגן עדן מנוחתם. לכן ברחמים יסרים בסדר גנפיו לעולמים, ויצור בצורכם ונשמותם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ינוחה בשלום משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
שיר המעלות. ממעמקים קראתיך אדוני, אדוני שמעה וקולי, תהיינה אוזניך קשובות לכל תחנוני. אם עוונות תשמוריה, אדוני מי יעמוד? כי עמך הסליחה למען תברא. קיוויתי אדוני קיוותה נפשי, ולדברו הוחלתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי עם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו פדות. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברך יראותי וימליך מלכותי, ויצמח פורקני ויקרב משיחי. בחיי חון וביום חון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה עם כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה משמעיה, וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
As the heart panteth after the water brooks, So panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. Whence shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been meet day and night, while they continually say to me, where is your God?
Moja dusza rozczula się, gdy wspominam, jak kroczyłem w tłumie, idąc do domu Bożego, wśród głosów radości i dziękczynienia świątecznego orszaku. Dlaczego się smucisz, moja duszo? Czemu się we mnie trwożysz? Zaufaj Bogu, bo jeszcze będę Go sławił. On jest moim zbawieniem i Bogiem.
Ко мне самому душа моя смятейся, сего ради помянух Тя от земли Иорданский и Ермонимский, от горы Малая. Бездна призывает ко главе, во гласе хляби Твоих, вся высоты Твоя и волны Твоя на мне пройдоша.
W dzień okazuje mi Pan swoją łaskę, a w nocy Mu śpiewam i modlę się do mojego Boga. Mówię do Boga: opoko moja, dlaczego mnie zapomniałeś? Czemu chodzę smutny? Czemu wróg mnie gnębi?
As with a sword in my bones, mine enemies reproach me, while they say daily unto me, where is thy God? Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou disquieted within me? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him, who is the health of my countenance and my God.
Psalm 42. Tęsknota za Bogiem i świątynią. Odmówili reprezentujący różne grupy ofiar, przedstawiciele judaizmu, Kościoła katolickiego, Kościoła prawosławnego, kościołów protestanckich i islamu. Bardzo dziękuję wszystkim duchownym, a Państwa proszę o zajęcie miejsc.
And please be seated.
And with a gathering of faiths and different tongues, this remarkable reflection upon the liberation of Auschwitz 80 years ago has come to its conclusion.
Szanowni Państwo, uprzejmie prosimy wszystkich Państwa o pozostanie na miejscach. Za chwilę ocalali oraz przewodniczący delegacji państwowych zostaną poproszeni
will be asked to light candles at the train car. So please remain seated.
The railway line along which everyone came to this place of engineered death. Now, with the candles being brought forward to be placed by the representatives of each of the nations that have come here, it is like its own set of carriages coming up towards the great gate through which all those who were exterminated came to their moment of selection. Those who were chosen to live and those who were chosen to die. With cold hearts and fiendish minds, the SS had created here the engineering of death, the industrial destruction of bodies, and they developed an exceptional indulgence for cruelty and torture. As fearful bullies, they echo, in a way, the words given in his address by Ronald Lauder. We don't want our past to be our children's future.
Szanowni Państwo, jako pierwszy
Each of those lamps taken in the hands of those who have their own deep memories will go with us to that cattle truck and trying to evoke the horrors, the loss, the enormity of 1.1 million people killed here alone. We witness their attempt to reflect and bring into the present the enormity of this place, this anniversary, and this warning from history. At 3:10 in the afternoon on the 1st of April 1940, the first prisoners arrived at Auschwitz. And it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as the light was dimming, on the 27th of January 1945, that the Red Army liberated this camp. This engine of death that had consumed so much life, so much hope, and delivered so much despair, can not be forgotten for the fact that human beings did it and that they achieved this horror for a belief that so many of them couldn't see as wrong. And each of those who spoke has tried to remind the world, in perhaps some of the last opportunities to reach out in their diminishing lives, a reminder that hate can destroy. And as one of those who did survive said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Tova Friedman was one of the three who gave her reflections. She had been just 5 years old when she came here with her mother to Auschwitz. She talked about being at eye level with the German shepherd dogs that were snarling. She didn't understand why they'd all had to take their clothes off and stand naked. As we see this railway line of thoughts coming towards the great gates of Auschwitz, the thoughts of those in the cattle trucks as the sound of the engine bringing them there altered, going underneath that great brick arch, and then so soon to be shouted at by the SS guards as they were pulled from the carts onto the point where they were divided into those who would live and die, and within an hour, those selected for death were taken to the gas chambers and had been killed. It is impossible to comprehend, but that she had to hide with her mother at the end of her time there on the day of liberation. She hid with her mother by climbing in amongst the corpses of the dead, pulling their limbs across theirs in order to avoid the final chance of death from their guards before their guards ran away. There's so much to remember here as each of these lights illuminates an opportunity to understand.
Szanowni Państwo, o złożenie zniczy proszę przewodniczących delegacji państwowych.
Of the official delegations to lay the votive candles.
After witnessing the pain with which some of those who laid their lamps let go of memories to lighten the understanding of the world, the heads of state, the President of Poland, and shortly on behalf of the United Kingdom, the King will lay his lamp for all those who have their thoughts at home.
Marking 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Those who still live today were young then. They were wrenched from the arms of their parents, older people, and the very young and the sick sent immediately to the gas chamber. Survivors now are those who never saw their relatives again. They are those who lied about their age in selection to be deemed fit to work. They are those who had forged papers, Jews living as Catholics moving from village to village. They are those who jumped off trains heading to Auschwitz during a disturbance, and applause there for President Zelensky of Ukraine. They are those who were born the day after the camp ran out of Cyclone B, the crystal pesticides used to murder so many in gas chambers. Each story extraordinary, because to survive was extraordinary. 85% of people sent to Auschwitz didn't make it. Those who did, they live to tell of the horrors. And the light now fallen on the camp at Birkenau. There is still snow on the ground here. It is just after 6 o'clock. It is when the doors would have been locked on the huts, crammed with people, 1,200 sleeping on racks of bunks. The temperature falling in winter to -20. Each minute, each hour, each week, a fight for survival, a fight to go unnoticed. A fight not to collapse, because to show weakness was to die here at the death camp that led to the deaths of 1.1 million people here in Poland. Well, good evening. You join us from Auschwitz-Birkenau. The ceremony we've just witnessed to mark 80 years since the liberation of this camp began with photos set to music by a German Jewish composer who was killed at Auschwitz. The carriage of a freight train, a symbol of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp, was placed directly in front of the main gate of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the service took place.
Standing before us is a railway wagon, a symbol of the suffering of all the victims of the Auschwitz concentration camp and extermination center. In particular, it is a reference to the tragic transports of the Hungarian Jews in 1944, the climax of the operation of this horrible place. This wagon was placed here on this very ramp 15 years ago as a symbol, thanks to the generous support of Frank Lowy. May the silent emptiness of this wagon be filled today with our living memory of all those who perished in Auschwitz. It is my honor to extend a warm welcome to the survivors. May I welcome their majesties, presidents, prime ministers, and all the heads of national delegations. May I welcome representatives of the Polish Parliament and parliamentarians from across Europe and around the world.
And then the stories of those who survived. Journalist and historian Marian Turski, who is now 98 years old, was sent to Auschwitz in 1944 and survived the westward death march to Buchenwald in 1945. He spoke at the ceremony today.
There's always been a very small minority of us who went through all those selections positively. That number itself was very little. And those who lived to see freedom, there were hardly none. So few. And now there is only a handful. Such a small bevy. That is why I believe that our thoughts should now go towards this huge majority, those millions of victims who will never tell us what they experienced, what they felt, just because they were consumed by that mass destruction.
We heard too from author Tova Friedman. She described her experience at Auschwitz, where she was transported with her mother when she was just 5 years old, and said the world must not repeat history.
I remember as a 5.5-year-old child watching from my hiding place in Starchowitz labor camp as all my little friends were rounded up and driven to their deaths, while the heartbreaking cries of their parents fell on deaf ears. After all the children were gone and the courtyard was empty, I thought to myself, am I the only Jewish child left in the world? Shortly thereafter, we were loaded into cattle cars. The men and women were separated. This was the very first time I ever saw my father cry. Up until then, no matter what horrors, no matter what happened to us, we were together. The three of us We were a family. But now he was sent to Dachau. And my mother and I here to this camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for fidgeting, for not being able to stand still for hours at an appel, a roll call, I looked into my mother's eyes. She was standing next to me, silently, and she was pleading with me, don't cry, hold on. And I didn't. I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me. At 5.5, I had the rebellion in me. I will not show them. I will not let them know the pain they're inflicting on me.
Well, our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, is here at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Sombre and sacred, the words used by King Charles to describe today. And so it proved in that event concluding tonight, Siobhan.
An absolutely remarkable event. To hear the words from witnesses of what is one of the greatest crimes in history at the place where those crimes happened was really beyond emotional. Tova, who you heard there, talking how as just a 5-year-old child being beaten by guards, she knew that her mother was impeaching her silently not to cry out, and that she had that rebellion within her to keep fighting. The warnings that we heard from several of the witnesses who spoke here, those survivors, saying, we have seen this in the past. It must not be allowed to be repeated in the present. And then ending that emotional ceremony on a procession of the living walking down the tracks that led so many to their deaths, carrying candles to remember those people, but also again to say, never again. And I think that is, of course, the message that these anniversaries always bring. But this year is particularly poignant because of the age of so many of the people who managed to survive Auschwitz, to survive the Holocaust. And they've said themselves that they're worried. They don't know how many more anniversaries they're going to be able to speak their truths, to tell their stories. And that's why, as King Charles said, it's really now a responsibility on the shoulders of the next generation to carry that on and not forget.
Siobhan, thank you. And we will see King Charles again soon from Birkenau. He will head to the Auschwitz main camp and see for himself the wall of death where so many people were shot. King Charles, who arrived here for the commemorative service today, had earlier been to a Jewish community centre as well, about an hour from here in Krakow, that he had become personally involved with since 2002, where he promised to make it happen, went again in 2008. And there they have a senior club where some 58 survivors can come and hold Shabbat dinners and sing in the choir and get a sense of community, which was so robbed from the Jews of Poland during the Holocaust. Some 3 million Jews living in Poland